There is something on almost every table in the world, a small shaker, or a cellar, or a pinch between the fingers. As salt, it is so ordinary now, so cheap, that it barely registers as a thing at all. But it was not always this way. Salt built roads, it preserved the dead, it funded kingdoms, started rebellions, and gave ordinary people a reason to walk 200 miles to the sea. This is the quiet history of that mineral. There is no rush tonight. Just settle in. Salt is not a thing that arrived with civilization. It was here long before any of that, before the first planted field, before the first fired kiln, before anyone had thought to press wet clay into a tablet and mark something into it. The mineral formed and dissolved and formed again on its own schedule, in its own time, according to chemistry, rather than to human need. It did not wait to be discovered. It simply was. This is a useful place to begin. Not with a moment of discovery, not with a name or a date, but with landscape, with the way the earth was before people organized their movements around what it contained. Think of a wide, shallow basin at the end of a long, hot season, a lake that was full of water in spring, drawing snowmelt down from surrounding hills, broad and faintly brown, shallow enough that you could see the bottom in most places. By midsummer, the water is lower. By late summer, in a dry year, it has pulled back toward the center of the basin, and what was the lake floor is now exposed at the edges, cracked mud, pale and baked hard, and at the very margin of the remaining water, where the surface meets the open air and the sun reaches longest through the afternoon, something white. A thin crust of mineral, salt crystals forming where the water evaporates fastest, at the rim, where the wind draws moisture from the surface and leaves behind what was dissolved in the water. The crust is thin at first, almost translucent in certain light, faintly luminous, the way hoarfrost looks just before it disappears. If you ran a finger along it, it would break easily, lifting pale grains onto the skin. If you brought that finger to your lips, you would know immediately what it was, not because you had tasted it here before, but because the taste is one of the oldest recognitions the body makes. Salt, the same mineral your blood already carries, the same that flavors the sea, the same chemical signal the body uses to regulate water, to move signals along nerves, to keep the heart beating at its ordinary steady pace. It tastes in a particular way, correct. This is where salt began, not in a factory or a mine, not yet, in a lakebed at the end of summer, where retreating water left the minerals it had been carrying, in coastal shallows where seawater pooled in natural hollows, and the sun did the work of evaporation, slowly, over days, in the ground itself, where underground streams had been filtering through salt-bearing rock for thousands of years, and rising to the surface as springs, with a particular mineral taste that animals came from some distance to drink. Before anyone harvested salt deliberately, other animals knew where it was. Deer knew, bison, elk, the early horses of the ancient steppe, creatures that needed the mineral, as all mammals do for muscle function, for nerve signals, for the movement of water in and out of cells, followed, over time, the trails that led them to where the ground held what they needed, a mineral spring, an exposed seam of salt-bearing rock, a dried lakebed where the white crust formed each summer. These paths were not subtle. An animal returning to the same salt lick, season after season, left a trail. Many animals using the same trail made it a worn groove in the landscape, a line of compacted earth through the grass, through the scrub, around the obstacles, toward the mineral. Such paths were readable. You could follow one without knowing where it led, and it would take you there. People moved through the same landscape. They read it in the same way. They found the same springs and lakebed margins and exposed hillside faces where white crystals collected in the afternoon heat. The paths that animals wore to salt became paths that people used too, sometimes following the animals themselves, sometimes simply reading the same landscape that the animals had already interpreted for them. And in some cases, over enormous stretches of time, those paths became roads. The oldest coastal method of salt production required almost no technology at all. Seawater drawn or carried into a shallow hollow in the ground near the shore and left to the sun and the wind. The water evaporated. What remained was the mineral it had been carrying. Scrape the crystals from the sides and floor of the hollow, collect them, use them or carry them. This process needed no invention. It needed only observation and patience, two things people had in abundance and had been applying to the natural world for a very long time before anyone thought to concentrate a brine spring in a pottery vessel or cut into a mountain to reach the rock beneath. Watch the water retreat. Watch the white appear at the rim. Come back when it is thick enough to be worth collecting. Return next season and the season after. That is all. The earliest confirmed evidence of deliberate salt production in Europe is dated to approximately 6,000 years before the Common Era. A place called Poiana Slatinei, in what is now Romania, near a town whose name still carries the old word for salt inside it. The people who worked there were not harvesting from a lakebed. They were doing something more considered. They had identified a brine spring, water rising naturally from the ground, with a higher than usual mineral content, and they were heating that water in pottery vessels to accelerate the evaporation process, concentrating the salt faster than the sun alone could manage. Fire and clay in the service of the mineral. What survives from Poiana Slatinei is not the work itself. The fires are gone, the boiling water is gone, the mineral scraped from the vessels and carried away, gone, used, dissolved into food, and then into people, and then into the long ordinary past. What survives is the pottery, fragments of the vessels that were broken after the salt was extracted, and no longer useful. These fragments are what archaeologists call briquetage, the debris of salt production, the broken remains of the process. Pottery shards in a particular pattern, stained in a particular way, that tell a trained eye exactly what was done there and approximately when. The work is gone, the broken pots remain. There is something to sit with in that. The production itself left almost no trace except for what it wore out and discarded. 80 centuries later, we know someone was making salt in that valley because of the litter they left behind. Not far from there, something else was beginning to take shape that would leave a different kind of record. In what is now Bulgaria, a town was growing, the earliest known town in Europe, according to the current archaeological evidence. A settlement at the site called Solnitsata, which means, roughly, salt works. And the town did not grow up around a river crossing, or a defensive hilltop, or a particularly fertile piece of valley floor. It grew around salt. The operation there was producing salt in quantities beyond what the local community needed. Quantities intended for trade, for movement out into the surrounding region, to communities that had no reliable local source. Salt that could be stored, transported, exchanged in, and the community that controlled that supply began to accumulate what surplus always accumulates: wealth, and then people, drawn by the work and by what the wealth could provide. A town built on white stone, the first in a long list of settlements whose existence and prosperity traced back, in some essential way, to the mineral in the ground beneath them. In the mountains of what is now Austria, the picture shifts again. At Holstadt, at the western end of a deep alpine lake, there is evidence of salt mining reaching back to the Neolithic, and intensifying around 1200 years before the Common Era. This is not lakebed salt, not evaporated brine. This is salt underground, in solid rock, reached by cutting tunnels into the mountain. Men going into the earth with tools and lamps, and carrying the mineral out on their backs. The mountain preserved something that an open lakebed never could. The air inside a deep salt mine holds almost no moisture. In such conditions, organic material does not rot. It simply dries and holds its shape and waits. What has been found in the Hallstatt mine is extraordinary in its ordinariness. Fragments of woven textile, fabric made 3,000 years ago, still holding its structure and in some cases its color, leather, wooden handles and hafts, rope twisted and knotted, and one remarkable object, a miner's backpack, leather and wooden frame, found where it had been left or dropped. Inside it, the remnants of what appears to have been his lunch. 3,000 years. The mineral that people went into the mountain to extract had, in the process, kept the traces of their work. The salt had preserved the tools of the people who dug it, just as it preserved the food in their homes above ground. There is a quiet completeness to that. The same mechanism, the same chemistry, turned on the evidence of its own production. Salt moved from Hallstatt downhill, along river valleys, into the lowlands where there was no local source. It was carried, traded, exchanged for other goods. The network that formed around that movement was wide enough, and lasted long enough, to leave its mark in language. In Central European place names, the syllable hall, from a Celtic root for salt, recurs across a considerable stretch of the map. Hallstatt itself, Hallein nearby, which was also a salt town, Halle in what is now Germany, another center of the trade. A trail of names strung across the landscape like markers, each one saying, here was salt, and here people came for it, and the coming was regular enough that it became part of the name of the place. A geography of commerce, still visible on ordinary maps, if you know what you're reading. Further north and east, another mine, Wieliczka, in what is now southern Poland, has been extracting salt from the rock beneath the Carpathian foothills since at least the 13th century. At its height, the operation supplied a significant portion of the Polish royal treasury, not occasionally, not in good years, but reliably, year after year, as a fundamental part of what the kingdom ran on. The mine continued operating, not reimagined, not replaced, not repeatedly suspended and revived, but operating in the continuous sense. The same mine, the same seam, the same basic process of cutting and extracting and sending the mineral to the surface. From the Middle Ages into the 20th century, 700 years, give or take. It is difficult to hold that number. 700 years encompasses every person who went underground in that mine, across every generation of that span, every political system that collected revenue from the salt, every war that the revenue helped pay for, every kitchen in every household that used what came up from below. The mechanism was always the same. The mineral was always the same. The need from one end of that span to the other never changed. Come back for a moment to the edge of the lake. The white crust at the rim of the retreating water, thin and faintly luminous in the low afternoon light. The kind of thing that catches the eye, not because it is spectacular, but because it is distinct. White against pale mud, sharp-edged where the crystals have formed cleanly, ragged and translucent at the margin where they are still growing. A finger run along the crust, pale grains on the skin, the taste on the tongue, immediate, unmistakable, the flavor the body recognizes before the mind has quite registered what has happened. This is not a discovery in the dramatic sense. A discovery implies a threshold, a moment of crossing from not knowing to knowing, a before and an after. What happens at the edge of the lake is quieter than that. It is a noticing, and then, because the noticing is useful, a return, and then another return and another, until returning has become a habit, and the habit has a warm path beside it, and the path has a particular character, the kind of path that exists because it leads somewhere worth going. Everything that came later follows from that. The mines, the salt towns, the trade networks, the roads that will appear in the next part of this story, the taxes and the rebellions and the words we still use for payment and for flavor, all of it traces back to the edge of that lake and the small return. From the lake's edge, the story moves now into a different kind of space, not the open air of a retreating shoreline, but the dry interior of a room where the mineral was doing something that must have seemed, to anyone who understood it for the first time, almost impossible to believe. Salt could slow the passage of time, or very nearly, the same property that flavored a piece of fish, its ability to draw moisture out of organic matter, to dry what was wet and hold it dry, could keep things intact far beyond the moment they would naturally have stopped. It could keep food through winter and through the season after and the season after that. And it could do something else, something that would come to seem even more important to certain people in certain places, for reasons that had nothing to do with food at all. Salt preserves. This is the most fundamental thing it does, and it is worth staying with that fact for a moment before any history attaches to it. When salt is applied to organic matter, to a piece of fish, a cut of meat, the skin of an animal, it draws moisture out of the tissue. This is simple chemistry, a movement of water across a gradient from a region of lower salt concentration to a higher one. The water leaves the flesh, and as the moisture goes, so too do the conditions in which microbes and decay can proceed. They need water to do their work. Salt, by removing the water, removes the possibility. The decay slows. The matter holds its shape. Given enough salt and enough time for the drying to complete, the preserved thing can last for months, or years, or, under the right conditions, far longer than that. Before refrigeration, this was the only reliable method. Before canning, before the sealed jar, before any of the technologies that now make the preservation of food so ordinary that we barely think about it. Salt was it, the singular technique available to any household, in any climate, in any era, that could make a perishable thing last. There was nothing else. In Egypt, along the Nile, this property of salt was understood and used with a practical directness that the administrative records make clear. The Nile supported fish in abundance, tilapia, Nile perch, catfish filling the river and the marshes along its edges. Caught fresh, a fish would keep for a day in a warm climate, maybe two. Salted and dried, rubbed with mineral, laid out in the dry heat, turned once, dried through. The same fish could keep for months. It could be transported, carried on a boat, loaded on a cart, distributed to workers at a site far from the river, stored in a granary and drawn down over weeks. This is how the fish appeared in administrative records from Egyptian construction sites, as rations listed alongside grain and beer, distributed in measured quantities to the workers building temples and tombs and monuments across the desert. Preserved fish, salted and dried, not fresh, were a dietary staple in the Egyptian labor economy. The same chemistry that kept the fish edible through a long journey also made large organized workforces viable at a distance from any natural water source. You could move the food to the workers. You did not have to move the workers to the food. But the salt Egypt is most associated with is not the fish salt. It is something called natron. Natron is not the same as ordinary table salt. It is a naturally occurring mineral compound, sodium carbonate mixed with sodium bicarbonate, and a fraction of sodium chloride, found in dried lakebeds in the desert. It forms in the same general way that salt forms at the edge of a retreating lake. Water evaporates, the mineral remains. But natron has a slightly different chemistry, a slightly different character, and its most important source in the ancient world was a depression west of the Nile Delta, a valley of dried lakes that still carries the mineral's name, the Wadi Natron. The Wadi Natron lies in the desert northwest of Cairo. In the ancient world, it was a journey of some days from the center of Egyptian civilization, close enough to be a managed resource, far enough to require organization to supply. The mineral collected there was transported north and east, to the cities, to the embalming houses, to the temples. It arrived in quantity, and it was used for more purposes than one. The purpose it is most associated with is the one that shaped Egyptian civilization in its most distinctive way. In mummification, natron was applied to the body, not rubbed on the surface, but packed around it and placed inside the body cavity, in linen pouches, in substantial quantity. The body was then left in the dry air of the embalming room for approximately 40 days. 40 days is a long time, longer than most things we wait for now, long enough for the natron to do its work fully, to draw the moisture from the tissue, to desiccate the body from the outside in, to create conditions in which decay could not continue. What remained after 40 days was dry, stable, the feature recognizably present, the person still he had occupied present, held in the shape they had occupied while living. The mineral that kept fish edible through winter had been found capable of keeping a body intact across centuries. The theological weight of this cannot be overstated, though it should be held quietly. Egyptian belief about death was built on a specific premise that the soul required the body to return to. The journey to the afterlife, as Egyptian cosmology described it, was not a permanent departure from physical form. The soul, or the several aspects of the soul, which Egyptian theology distinguished carefully, needed the body to come back to. The body had to survive. Without preservation, without the intact physical form, the journey could not complete as it was supposed to. Salt, specifically natron, was not incidental to this cosmology. It was structurally required. The entire architecture of Egyptian belief about what happened after death depended on a mineral compound found in a desert valley, transported by organized labor, applied in a specific period, in a specific sequence. Without the mineral, the cosmology could not function. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. One of the most elaborate systems of belief in the ancient world, the one that produced the pyramids and the Book of the Dead, and 3,000 years of consistent religious iconography, rested, in a very practical sense, on the chemistry of a salt. The Wadi Natron was, as a result, a serious matter of administration. Egyptian records describe it as a controlled resource, not simply a place where anyone might go and collect what they needed, but a managed supply, gathered by organized labor, transported to where it was required, and distribute according to the needs of the embalming houses and the temples. Even in its most sacred application, natron moved through what was, in effect, a logistics system. Officials tracked its supply, scribes recorded its distribution, workers extracted it, porters moved it, administrators allocated it. Salt and administration arrived together in Egypt early, and they would not be separated again. Natron's uses extended well beyond the embalming room. It cleaned the skin, used as a kind of abrasive wash. It cleaned and whitened teeth. It bleached cloth, stripping color from fabric that needed to be neutralized before dyeing or made ceremonially white. It assisted in the production of glass and glaze, providing the alkali that made the fusion of silica possible. In temple ceremonies, it served as a purifying agent, applied to ritual objects, used in washing before approaching the sacred dye. A single mineral doing the work of several distinct categories of product. The household that used natron was not using a specialist substance reserved for funerary ritual. It was using a versatile compound that appeared at almost every stage of daily life, from the most ordinary, cleaning a face in the morning, to the most profound. Think of the embalming room itself. Somewhere in a large Egyptian city, a house set slightly apart, its door a little wider than those around it, the air inside dry and still, the smell of natron, mineral and slightly alkaline, something a little like the inside of a stone building after rain, not unpleasant, present in the room before you have quite registered where it is coming from. The body on the table, cooling in the dry air, the linen pouches being prepared, packed with the white-grey mineral. The 40 days ahead, a period of stillness, of waiting, of the mineral doing its slow work without assistance or oversight, the way salt always worked, quietly, at its own pace, according to chemistry rather than intention. The same basic process as the fish drying on a rack at the riverbank, the same chemical mechanism operating on a different kind of matter, in service of a different kind of need. Salt does not distinguish between food and flesh. The mechanism is identical. What changes is what the preservation is for. There is a quieter observation that this suggests, and it does not need to be pressed too hard. Salt touches the boundary between living and not living, and holds things there. It does not reverse what has happened, it does not restore, but it preserves the form of things beyond the moment they stop, keeps the shape of what was once present, intact, available for return or for recognition, or simply for continued presence. It is not surprising that cultures which depended on salt for the preservation of food eventually found themselves depending on it for something they considered more important than food. And it is not surprising that the mineral accumulated over time a dimension that those cultures called sacred, not because anyone made a conscious decision to elevate it, but because the same substance that kept the fish and kept the body had acquired, through that double work, a particular kind of weight. Something that preserves, in a world where decay is constant and loss is ordinary, holds a kind of power. People notice that. People have always noticed that. Salt as preservation extends from the practical to the cosmic, and the two were never entirely separate. The same mineral that fed the workers building a monument also held the body of the person the monument was built for. The same compound that cleaned a face in the morning maintained a civilization's entire understanding of what death was and what it meant. And wherever something is essential, wherever a single substance underlies both the ordinary and the profound, there will eventually be a road built to carry it. Salt is heavy. This is not a complicated observation, but it has shaped more of the physical world than most heavier things. A handful of salt weighs almost nothing. A jarful is noticeable. A sack of it, a block of it, a load of it balanced across the back of an animal or the shoulders of a person. That weight requires a path. And a path used by enough people carrying the same load in the same direction over enough years becomes something more than a path. It becomes a route, and a route that matters enough becomes, eventually, a road. The earliest salt routes were animal trails, then worn human paths, then beaten earth tracks, regular enough in their use and their direction that they became permanent features of the landscape. Things that other people followed not because they had found the route themselves, but because the route was simply there, already marked, already known to go somewhere useful. This is one of the oldest ways that physical infrastructure comes into being, not planned, not built by any coordinating authority, but worn into existence by the repetition of the same movement toward the same destination. Salt geography shaped the roots, and the roots shaped everything that came after them. There is a road in Italy that is older than Rome. It runs northeast from the city toward the Adriatic coast, a distance of about 240 kilometers, through hills and then across flat land toward the sea. The road has a name that is, in the most literal possible sense, a description of what it was for: Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Before Rome existed as a city, a path ran along this route, a Sabine trail, older than any Roman political authority, worn by the movement of people between the interior highlands and the coast where sea salt was gathered. Rome grew up beside a route that already had a direction and a purpose, and in a sense, a name, because anyone who used it knew what they were going for. The geography explains why this particular coast, rather than the one closer to the city, the Tyrrhenian Sea, the sea to the west of Rome, is deep. Deep water does not lend itself to the solar evaporation of seawater in shallow pans. It is the shallowness of the coastal water that allows the sun to heat the brine in productive pans, and that allows the pans to be managed practically. The Adriatic, on the east coast, is considerably shallower, particularly in its northern reaches. Its coastline was productive for salt, in a way the western coast was not. The shape of the seabed determined where the road went. Salt geography is also a kind of physical geography, a reading of the land and the water for what they can and cannot offer. As Rome grew and the city's reach extended, salt ceased to be simply a commodity that merchants and traders moved along the old route. It became a matter of state. The Roman administration recognized early that salt was not like other goods. Other goods could be managed at the margins, taxed, regulated, left largely to the mechanisms of private trade. Salt was different because it was not optional. Everyone needed it. In every season, regardless of circumstance, a state that controlled salt controlled something no subject could choose to go without, and a state that recognized this could turn that position into revenue. So Rome did what administrations tend to do when they identify something essential. They took charge of it. The distribution of salt was brought under official control, prices managed, movement regulated, the trade taxed and supervised. The Via Salaria was no longer merely a useful old path. It was infrastructure the state depended on and therefore needed to maintain, protect and manage. The road had become, in the process of the city's growth, an instrument of policy. This was not a decision made once by a single authority. It was a gradual process, a tightening of oversight that followed the logic of essential commodities everywhere. The moment salt became indispensable to an economy, it became interesting to the people who administered that economy. The pattern repeated itself wherever the mineral was scarce. Salt routes crossed North Africa. Long desert passages between sources near the coast and populations in the interior. They crossed the Arabian Peninsula and the trade networks of Central Asia. Wherever people lived at a distance from any reliable local source of salt, they built or maintained a route to somewhere that had more. The map of early trade is, in significant part, a map of salt movement, a record of where the mineral was and where it was not, and what people did about that gap. The Hallstatt mines in the Alps had supplied a trade network stretching deep into Central Europe for centuries before Rome existed. The place names, Hallstatt, Hallein, Halle, mark where that trade was concentrated enough, long enough, to leave its trace in the names communities gave themselves. And the roads along which that salt moved were also roads along which other things moved. People, ideas, objects, the slow ordinary traffic of connected places. A road built to carry one thing will carry everything else as well. Salt roads were always more than salt roads. In the Roman world, salt was not only a raw mineral, it was also an ingredient in one of the most widely used condiments the ancient world ever produced, and that condiment moved along the same roads in enormous quantities. Garum, a fermented fish sauce made by packing fish, whole small fish, or fish entrails, or the trimmings from larger fish, in alternating layers of salt, in stone vats or ceramic tanks, and leaving them to liquefy in the sun over a period of months. The protein in the fish broke down under the salt, and the heat into a dark, intensely flavored liquid. That liquid was then drawn off, filtered, and transferred to amphorae for transport and sale. The smell of a garum production facility was, by all accounts, remarkable. The process of decomposition, even arrested and directed by the salt, produced an odor that extended a considerable distance from the site. Roman writers mention this in passing, with neither great alarm nor great complaint. It was simply the smell that accompanied production. The Romans were not squeamish about their condiment. Garum appeared on virtually every Roman table, from the wealthiest household to the most modest. It was what Romans reached for the way people now reach for salt, to season, to deepen, to complete a dish. The sauce was traded across extraordinary distances. Production facilities operated in Spain, in North Africa, on the Black Sea coast, wherever the combination of fish and salt and warm weather could be maintained at scale. The amphorae that held garum have been found across the entire extent of the empire. In Britain, at the far northwestern edge of Roman Reach, in Egypt, at the southeastern edge, in the Danube provinces, in what is now Turkey, in cities throughout the Mediterranean basin. The salt had traveled inside the fish during production, then inside the processed sauce inside the sealed jar. A road did not need to be explicitly a salt road to carry salt. Salt was present in the cargo regardless. And whatever road carried the salt also carried everything else. This is the other thing to understand about the Via Salaria and about the salt routes of the Hanseatic network that would come later, and about the camel paths across the Sahara that will come into this story shortly. Roads built to move one essential commodity become the arteries of everything. Soldiers move on them, messages move on them, grain, animals, building materials, physicians, news. The infrastructure whose original purpose was to get salt from where it was to where it was needed became, in every case, the infrastructure on which the broader economy ran. Because the salt had to move, the road was built. Because the road existed, everything else could move too. The need to carry white stone, again and again, from the place it occurred to the place it was required, that necessity built the physical skeleton of the ancient world. Salt built the roads, and wherever there is a road, wherever goods move in quantity from one place to another, the question of who has the right to charge for their movement eventually arises. In the next part of the story, that question takes a different shape. Not a tax on a road, not a toll at a gate, but the older question of whether the mineral itself could function as the payment, whether salt could be money rather than just the reason money was needed. There is a word in English that most people use without giving it a second thought: salary. The money paid to a worker, measured by the week or the month, a regular sum that represents the value of work done. It is an ordinary word, a neutral word, the kind of word that carries no particular history on its surface, but the word carries salt inside it. Salary comes from the Latin salarium, an allowance, a sum given to soldiers in the Roman army. The word itself is unambiguously connected to sal, the Latin for salt. That connection is old enough that Romananters themselves made it. The explanation offered by more than one ancient author is that the allowance was said to be originally salt money, a payment connected, in its origin, to the purchase or supply of salt. That phrase, said to be originally, is worth pausing on. The hedge was already there in antiquity. The Romans who wrote about salarium were not reporting a fact they had witnessed or a practice they knew to be current. They were repeating a received explanation, hedged in the same way we hedge things when we are not quite certain, but the explanation seems plausible. Said to be. Perhaps it is told that the more dramatic version of this story, that Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt, given physical blocks or measures of the mineral rather than coins, is one of the most widely repeated facts about the ancient world. It is satisfying in its symmetry, the idea that the word for money was once the thing itself. It travels well. The problem is that the records do not support it. Classicists who have examined the documentary evidence of Roman military pay, the papyri, the inscriptions, the accounts that have survived from military sites, find no record of soldiers receiving salt as a component of their payment. What soldiers received was money, denarii, actual coins, the same currency the rest of the empire used. An allowance called salarium may have existed, may have been connected in some way to the purchase of salt or other provisions, but the payment was monetary. The vivid image, a soldier carrying a leather sack of salt as a month's pay, does not appear in the evidence. It appears in popular histories, in dictionaries that repeat the etymology, without scrutinizing the claim, in the general human preference for a story that is clean and concrete over one that is ambiguous and qualified. It is worth saying this clearly, not to correct anyone in particular, but because the uncertainty is genuinely interesting. The word salary is a salt word that is not in dispute. The connection between salt and payment was real enough in the Roman mind that the Romans made it explicitly. They used a salt-derived word for their military allowance, and they offered an explanation for why. They just hedged it themselves. The explanation was said to be, even to the people who lived close to the practice. Some things are old enough that by the time anyone thinks to record them, they have already become half legend, true in a general sense, uncertain in the specific one. What the salary story points toward, even if the literal mechanics are uncertain, is a real relationship between salt and value, between salt and the concept of payment, between the mineral's practical necessity and the human tendency to let necessary things become the standard against which other things are measured. In West Africa, that relationship was not a matter of etymology. It was a matter of daily economic life. Salt is scarce in the interior of West Africa, far from any coast, far from the surface salt deposits of the northern desert, and with no significant local mineral springs to substitute. Communities that needed salt, which is to say all communities, had to obtain it from elsewhere at a cost that reflected how far it had come and how difficult the journey was. In such conditions, salt behaved like money, because money is simply a medium that everyone agrees to accept, and salt was something no one could refuse. Portable, divisible, universally necessary, durable enough to survive transport, salt met the practical requirements of a currency without needing to be formally designated as one. It was accepted in exchange for other goods, not by convention or decree, but by the simple logic of common need. Where food could not be safely preserved without it, where the body required it for basic function, the mineral that provided it was worth whatever you could get for it. Tagaza, a salt mining center in what is now the far north of Mali, deep in the Sahara, approximately 800 kilometers north of Timbuktu. In the 14th century, When it was operating at its peak, the journey from the nearest major city to the north, Sijil Masa, in present-day Morocco, took 25 days across open desert. 25 days of moving through sand and heat and the particular absolute stillness that desert travel in that region produces, toward a place that barely appeared on the horizon until you were almost at it. Ibn Battuta arrived at Tagaza in 1352 in the middle of a journey that would eventually make him the most widely traveled person of his era. He was not easily impressed. He had been to Constantinople and to Mali, to the courts of the sultans and the edges of the known world. His account of Tagaza is spare and precise. No trees, only sand and the mine, the water brackish, the village full of flies. The buildings were made of salt. Not stone that resembled salt, not plaster over a salt-bearing rock. The buildings themselves, the walls of the houses and the mosque, were constructed from thick slabs of rock salt, cut from the ground. The roofs were camel skins, stretched over the salt walls. The floor beneath your feet was salt. The wall you leaned against was salt. In rain, which was rare, because this was the Sahara, the walls would slowly dissolve and eventually need to be rebuilt, but rain was rare. Ibn Battuta found this notable. The most valuable commodity in the region was also the most ordinary material in the place where it was produced. The substance that would multiply in value fourfold by the time it reached a southern market was what the townspeople walked on and leaned against and worshipped inside. There is a particular kind of strangeness in that, the kind that does not announce itself dramatically, but simply sits there when you look directly at it. A mosque with walls of salt, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. The work of extracting the salt was done by workers whose conditions Ibn Battuta describes plainly, people with no practical choice about the labor, in a place with no fresh water, no shade, nothing of their own to eat but what the caravans brought in. They ate dates imported from the north, camel meat, and millet imported from the south. Everything except the salt had to be brought in at significant cost and effort. The one commodity the place produced in abundance was the one commodity the workers there could not use to feed themselves. Ibn Battuta noted the economic paradox without belaboring it. For all its squalor, he wrote, "Quintars of gold dust are traded in Tagaza. A quintar is a substantial weight. The gold dust passing through this fly-blown, brackish, doorless town was real and considerable. The mechanics of the trade are worth following, because they show exactly how the mineral's value was constructed. Salt was cut from the ground in the mine and shaped into rectangular slabs, thick, heavy, pale. 2 slabs to a camel, one on each side, balanced carefully for the long journey south. The camels moved in caravans, organized and led by the Masufa guides, who knew the desert routes, traveling across open sand toward Uwalata and eventually to Timbuktu. The cost of that transport was not small. Researchers who have studied the economics of the trans-Saharan trade estimate that the fees for transportation, the cost of the camels, the guides, the water, the organization of the caravan across 800 kilometers of desert amounted to roughly 80% of the salt's total value. The mineral was not especially expensive to extract. What made it valuable was the cost of moving it. By the time a slab of Tagaza salt arrived in Timbuktu, its price had multiplied roughly fourfold over what it had been at Owalata, the first southern trading post. Ibn Battuta observed it trading at rates approaching its weight in gold, which, in a market context, reflected not the salt's intrinsic rarity, but the sheer distance and difficulty of its arrival. Gold moved in the opposite direction. The kingdoms and trading cities of the West African interior, Mali, Songhai, the city-states of the Niger Bend, sat on top of some of the most productive gold fields in the medieval world. Gold came out of the rivers and the mines in substantial quantities. It went north in bars, in dust, in bricks, in carefully measured weights, carried by the same caravans that had brought the salt south, moving back across the desert toward Sijil Masa, and from there into the Mediterranean trade networks of the north. It was struck into Almoravid dinars and circulated through markets from Morocco to the ports of Spain and Italy. Tagaza sat at the crossing point of these two flows. Salt moved south, gold moved north. Each side of the desert had something the other needed, and the exchange happened in a town that could barely sustain life, that had no fresh water, no shade, no food of its own, nothing to recommend it except the mineral in the ground beneath it and the fact of its position between two kinds of wealth. It is one of the stranger images in this history. A salt mine in the deepest desert, its mosque built from what it sold, visited by gold dust in quantities that made it economically extraordinary despite being materially almost nothing. Far to the north of the Sahara, the same logic, that salt's necessity made it as valuable as anything that could be exchanged for it, was at work in a very different kind of landscape. Not desert, cold water, grey sky, the Baltic Sea in January, and a fish that, without salt, was worthless by the time it reached the markets of northern Europe, but with salt could cross that sea and feed a continent through winter and through Lent. That part of the story comes next. The Baltic Sea in winter is grey, in a way that does not distinguish between sky and water except at the horizon, where a darker line of cold marks where one ends and the other begins. Ships moved across it nonetheless, flat-bottomed, wide-beamed merchant cogs, their sails taking what wind there was, riding low with cargo. In autumn, when the season turned and the water began to chill, some of that cargo was something that had spent its recent weeks being packed carefully, in layers, into barrels. Dark wood, tight staves, the smell of sea brine and cold air, and something else beneath it, the smell of the fish. A barrel of salted herring, unremarkable in itself, common enough that it sat in the holds of hundreds of ships at any given autumn moment, stacked and braced against the roll of the water. That cargo and the mineral it required would reshape the commercial map of the North in ways that took a century to complete. Herring were extraordinarily abundant in the Baltic Sea in the medieval period. Contemporary accounts are worth taking at face value because the temptation is to read them as exaggeration, the kind of flourish common in travel writing from any era, but the documentation from merchants, church records and market accounts consistently describes the same thing. In the late summer and early autumn, the Baltic herring schooled in such enormous numbers along the southern Swedish coast that the sea appeared, to those who saw it in season, to thicken with them. Not dense exactly, but changed, a surface that moved differently when the fish were there. The herring ran every year, reliably, in a way that made them one of the most dependable food resources in northern Europe. An enormous, concentrated protein supply, available in consistent quantity, each autumn, in the same places. The problem was time. A herring caught today cannot wait. In the climate of northern Europe, without refrigeration, a fresh herring was edible for a day, perhaps two in cold weather. Beyond that, it was past the point where any market would accept it. All the abundance of the Baltic run, all the reliability of the annual school, was worth nothing if the fish could not be slowed, if there was no way to pause it, hold it, make it durable enough to carry any distance at all. Salt made the fish worth catching. The method was simple in principle, though the timing was exacting. A herring caught fresh was cleaned and packed in alternating layers with salt, fish, then salt, then fish, then salt, in a barrel, sealed and left. The salt drew moisture from the flesh. What remained after some days was firm, dense, pale, and very nearly shelf-stable. Properly packed, a barrel of salted herring could survive months of transport and storage. Arriving at the far end of a winter's journey, still edible, still nutritious, still capable of feeding a household, or a monastery, or a garrison, through the cold months when no fresh fish was available. The barrel had to be tight. The salt had to be the right grade, coarse enough to work through the layers without turning to paste, even enough to do its job from edge to center. The fish had to be fresh when they went in. Get any one of those things wrong, and the barrel was lost. But when everything worked, the result was something that had not existed on the morning the fish was caught. A durable, portable, tradable protein supply. Something that could move through the world. Medieval Europe had a particular appetite for preserved fish, and the reason was theological as much as practical. The Catholic Church's dietary calendar required abstinence from meat on Fridays, on the vigils of major feasts, and throughout the 40 days of Lent, a period that, calculated across the full churched calendar in a northern European city, could account for roughly a third of all days in the year. Meat was forbidden on those days. Fish was not, and fish that could be preserved and transported, fish that did not require a river or a nearby coast to be available, was in demand everywhere the calendar ran. That calendar ran across all of Catholic Europe. Salt-cured herring was one of the principal answers. It could reach places that had no access to fresh fish whatsoever. It could be distributed to workers and soldiers and pilgrims and the urban poor in the middle of winter, in cities hundreds of miles from any coast, on days when no alternative protein was permissible. It was filling relatively cheap in comparison to fresh alternatives, and acceptable when meat was not. The intersection of theology and appetite created a market at a scale that transformed the herring from a seasonal abundance into the engine of a trading economy. The fishery that supplied this demand operated primarily around the island of Scania, the southern tip of what is now Sweden. In the autumn season, merchants converged on the Scania fairs from many cities, not just Scandinavian traders, but those from the German cities of the Baltic coast, from Lübeck and Stralsund and Rostock and Hamburg, from the inland trading centers of the Rhine Valley and beyond. The fish was the opportunity, the salt was the problem. Northern Europe was not well supplied with salt. The Baltic coast produced some, but not in the quantities the herring fishery required at commercial scale. The salt needed to preserve Baltic herring in volume came from elsewhere, from the Bay of Biscay on the Atlantic coast, where the long, flat coastal marshes of France and Portugal produced salt by solar evaporation in quantities far beyond local need, and from the salt workings of Lüneburg in northern Germany. Good salt, clean and coarse, in sufficient supply to pack thousands of barrels. All of it had to travel north before a single herring could be packed. Which meant the herring trade was not, at its foundation, a fishing problem. It was a salt logistics problem. Who controlled the supply, and at what price, and on what terms of transport? That was the question on which the whole enterprise turned. Out of that logistical requirement, something unprecedented began to take shape. The Hanseatic League did not come into existence in a single moment by a single decision. It grew gradually through the 12th and 13th centuries out of agreements between merchants from different cities who found that cooperation served their interests better than competition. Shared trade terms, shared warehouses in foreign ports, the Steelyard in London, the Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice, mutual protection of commercial interests along the routes they all depended on. common weights and measures, when they could manage it. It was not a nation, it was not an army, it was not even, in any formal legal sense, a single organization for most of its existence. It was a network of city merchants, from Lübeck and Hamburg and Danzig and Cologne and perhaps 100 other cities at its peak, who had concluded that their interests aligned enough to protect collectively. What held the network together was not a constitution or a crown. It was commerce, the same goods moving along the same routes, through the same ports, on the same terms. Salt and herring were among the commodities at its center. In 1370, the League went to war with Denmark. The cause was access to the Scanian herring markets. The Danish crown had been attempting to assert greater control over the trade, moving through the Øresund, the narrow strait between Denmark and the Swedish coast, through which all maritime traffic between the Baltic and the North Sea had to pass. A toll at the Øresund was, effectively, a toll on everything. The Hanseatic merchants understood this with precision. The League mobilized. The war was brief, and the League won. The Peace of Stralsund, signed in 1370, was one of the most commercially significant treaties of the medieval period. It confirmed Hanseatic trading rights at the Scanian fishery and gave the League effective control, for the duration of its dominance over the single passage between the two seas, a fish war settled in the language of commercial concessions. Then the herring moved. Not all at once, not dramatically. Sometime in the early decades of the 15th century, the major herring spawning grounds began to shift. The great schools that had run reliably along the Scanian coast thinned. The fish began appearing in greater numbers in the North Sea, off the coast of what is now the Netherlands. A different body of water, outside the Hanseatic zone of influence, closer to different ports and different merchants. The reason is still debated. Changes in water temperature, or in the patterns of current that governed where cold and warm water met along the seabed. Perhaps a shift in the salinity of the Baltic itself, driven by changes in river inflow during a cooler climatic period. The sea reorganized its fish without consulting anyone about the commercial implications. The Dutch were ready. Dutch herring buses, large, specialized fishing vessels designed to remain at sea for weeks rather than days, could follow the fish wherever they went. They carried the salt they needed on board, packed their catch at sea rather than returning to port uncured, and arrived home with barrels ready to sell. They used Iberian salt, shipped north from the Atlantic marshes in quantities that Dutch trading networks had been cultivating for decades. The process was efficient in a way the Scanian, shore-based operation had never been required to be. The Dutch cured their herring at sea, cutting the time between catch and preservation to hours. By the late 15th century, the Dutch herring trade was one of the pillars of what would become, in the following century, a Dutch commercial empire that reached as far as the East Indies. The herring had not moved far, geographically, but the direction of its migration had rearranged the commercial advantage of a continent. There was a parallel story unfolding at the same time, not on the Baltic, but on the other side of an ocean. In the shallow, cold, and enormously productive waters of the Grand Banks, off the coast of what is now Newfoundland, cod gathered in numbers that rivaled the Baltic herring at its peak. Salt cod was a different product from salted herring. Dried and pressed with salt rather than packed wet, the result was something harder, paler, almost board-like, shelf-stable for months, without further treatment. You could break a piece of salt cod from a slab and carry it in a pack across a mountain pass. You could store it in a cellar in a dry Mediterranean climate and draw from it the following spring. The Mediterranean world could not access fresh North Atlantic cod, and did not need to. Salt cod came to them, preserved and dried by Portuguese and Basque and English fishermen at the banks, carried south through Atlantic trade routes, arriving in Lisbon and Seville and Naples and Genoa as a perfectly durable protein supply. The salt had traveled from Atlantic coast marshes to the Grand Banks, to the fish to the Iberian harbors, and from there across the whole basin of the inland sea. All of it, the herring barrel, the merchant alliance, the treaty that restructured northern European trade, the migration that transferred advantage from one coastline to another, followed from the single requirement that a perishable fish needs something to make it last. Without a reliable supply of salt, the herring run produced nothing but a brief abundance that spoiled before it could be moved. With salt, it produced an economy and eventually a political order. The mineral made the food made the merchants made the alliance went to war over a body of water, and the treaty of that war shaped the political economy of northern Europe for a century. In France, around the same time, the state had arrived at its own conclusion about the mineral. If salt was something no one could do without, then a government's relationship to salt was not a commercial matter, it was a fiscal one. There is a particular kind of early morning in northern France, cold, grey, the mist still sitting in the lower ground, the roads not yet busy, that lends itself to waiting. A cart, a horse, a merchant standing with his load at the edge of a region whose boundaries exist entirely on paper, but whose consequences are entirely material. His salt has already been paid for. He bought it legitimately, from a source in a region where the tax was low. He is now attempting to enter a region where the same mineral costs 5 times more at the government depot, where selling his legitimately purchased salt at a price below the official rate is not a grey area, but a named crime. The courts are clear on this. The courts are busy with exactly this. This is the world the gabelle created. The French royal salt tax did not arrive fully formed from a single royal decree. It accumulated, as French royal authority itself accumulated, in layers over centuries. Salt taxes had existed in France in various forms since at least the 13th century, but it was under Charles V, around 1360, that the gabelle was systematized into the structure that would persist, with modifications, for the next several hundred years. The word itself may derive from an Arabic term for tax or tribute, arrived into French by way of Italian and Provençal, carried north through the trading languages of the Mediterranean coast, settling into ordinary administrative language without anyone marking the journey. A tax named with a borrowed word, from a language associated with markets and long-distance trade. Fitting, in its way, salt and Arabic words had been moving north together for some time. What made the gabelle distinctive was not its existence. Salt taxes were common across medieval Europe, but its architecture. France was divided into salt tax zones. The Pays de Grande Gabelle, the regions of high tax, covered much of the country's heartland, including the most densely populated areas around Paris. The Pays de Petite Gabelle applied lower rates to certain coastal and southern regions. The Pays de Court Bouillon and other intermediate designations covered their own specific arrangements, and a number of regions, Brittany most prominently, and parts of the south, had negotiated exemptions at various points in their absorption into the French crown, paying effectively nothing at all. The differential was not modest. In the high tax zones, a setia of salt, roughly 100 litres, might cost a peasant family 20 or even 30 times what a family in Brittany paid for the same mineral. not because the salt in the high-tax zone had traveled further, or was more difficult to obtain, or was in any way superior. Because the administrative boundary said so, and the boundary had the force of law. In the Pays de Grande Gabelle, the inequality was made concrete by an institution called the grenier à sel, the salt granary or salt store. These were state-licensed depots positioned across the high-tax zones, from which residents were required to purchase their salt, not merely allowed to purchase it, required. Every household above a certain threshold, and the threshold was not high, was obligated to buy a minimum quantity of salt per year from the grenier at the grenier's price. This was the sel du devoir, the duty salt. You did not need to have run short. You did not need to have exhausted your previous purchase. On the appointed schedule, the purchase was owed. The salt was in the granary. The granary was a state operation. The price was what the state had set. You bought it because the obligation was recorded and enforced, and there was no alternative provided by law. The state did not merely tax the movement of salt, it owned the entire transaction. The salt in the granaries was state salt, purchased by the Crown, held in state facilities, sold at state-determined prices to buyers who had no legal recourse if the price rose or the quality dropped. Buying salt from any other source within the high tax zones was a criminal act. Selling it privately was a criminal act. Transporting untaxed salt across a regional boundary was a criminal act. Even possessing salt in quantities that could not be accounted for by official purchase was grounds for investigation. The gabelle did not merely tax salt, it monopolized it. The Crown had looked at an essential mineral and concluded that the way to extract maximum revenue from it was not to tax each transaction, but to own the whole transaction, from purchase to sale, with every variable set by the state and every deviation criminalized. The result was predictably smuggling. The price differential between tax zones was so large and so arbitrary in its geography that moving untaxed salt from a low-tax or exempted region into a high-tax zone was enormously profitable. The margin between what salt cost in Brittany and what it cost at a Parisian grenier was wide enough to absorb significant risk and still leave a return worth the effort. The people who made that calculation were called faux sauniers, false salt merchants, salt smugglers, and they were common enough to have their own name and their own courts. The faux sauniers' trade was not casual. It was organized, geographically precise, and often well informed about the movements of the enforcement officers who pursued it. The routes followed the borders between tax zones with the same logic as any customs arbitrage. Acquire the commodity where it is cheap, carry it across an administrative line, sell it where it is expensive, keep the difference. The same paths walked repeatedly, the same crossings, at the same time of morning, by people who had made the calculation and decided the margin was worth it. The penalties for being caught were severe in proportion to how common the crime was. Fines, which could be ruinous to a small trader. Confiscation of the goods, the cart, the horse. Imprisonment. For repeat offenders, or for those caught with significant quantities, forced labor on the royal galleys, a sentence that meant years of chained rowing in Mediterranean waters, in conditions that everyone at the time understood to be a slow kind of death. The courts that handled salt offences were busy courts. The crime was not rare because the incentive was enormous. The legal price bore no relation to any natural cost of production or transport. It was purely administrative in origin, set to maximize revenue rather than to reflect market conditions. The people most likely to resort to smuggling were precisely the people who could least afford the official price. The gabelle's inequity did not merely inconvenience the poor. It systematically exposed them to criminal sanction for seeking a price that their neighbors, across an arbitrary administrative line, paid without restriction or consequence. This is the world that the Cahiers de Doléances recorded in 1789. When the Estates General convened, the books of grievances submitted by communities across France were not confined to abstract constitutional complaints. They listed specific material harms in specific terms from specific places. The gabelle appeared in them with some regularity. The selle du devoir, the greniers, the enforcement courts, the disproportion between regions, the way the tax pressed hardest on the people least able to absorb it. Alongside complaints about serfdom and road-building obligations and the privileges of the nobility, there was the salt. The gabelle was abolished in 1790. One of the first concrete fiscal reforms of the Revolution passed with relative speed in a body otherwise engaged in debating every structural question about French governance simultaneously. An administrative structure that had persisted for 430 years dissolved in the early months of a new order. This is not quite where the story ends. Napoleon, reorganizing the French state on what he believed to be a rational administrative basis, reinstated the salt tax in 1806. The logic was unchanged from 1360. Salt is something every household requires, in every season, regardless of income or circumstance. A tax on it reaches every subject without discrimination. In fiscal terms, it is perfectly efficient in its coverage, even if it is perfectly regressive in its incidence, taking from the poor a higher proportion of their resources than from the rich, because the poor cannot reduce their need for the mineral to reduce their tax burden. Napoleon's salt tax was not the gabelle in its full medieval complexity. There were no greniers, no selle du devoir, no Baroque system of regional differentials with their Byzantine categories and exceptions. A simpler structure, yes, but a state charge on a necessary mineral applied across the population without regard for ability to pay. Arrived at by a more streamlined route, the tax lasted through the 19th century and into the 20th, through the First World War and the interwar years and the Second World War, during which salt was rationed in France as an essential resource. The French salt tax was finally and completely abolished in 1945, 585 years after Charles V had systematized it into the structure that the revolution had briefly undone. Every government that had examined its options from the 14th century to the 20th and looked at what was essential had reached the same conclusion. Salt is something everyone needs. A tax on it reaches everyone. The logic is simple enough that it had to be abolished twice. If France offered the most elaborate administrative structure built around salt, then India offered, at almost the same historical moment the French tax was finally ending, the most consequential political response to that logic. Not a reform, not a legislative challenge, a walk. Two things happened in the 20th century in different parts of the world that together show how fully the weight of salt had shifted from the thing that built roads and funded empires to the thing that was simply there. One happened on a beach in Western India on a morning in early April. The other happened slowly, almost invisibly, beneath a field in the northwest of England over a period of years that no one was watching closely enough. Between them, they mark something like the end of the long arc this episode has been following. The moment when salt stopped being the thing that shaped everything and became instead something that was just there. India under British colonial administration was governed, among many other instruments, by a piece of legislation that most colonial subjects understood immediately and personally: the Salt Act. The law had evolved through various iterations across the 19th century, consolidating by the 1880s into its most restrictive form. Its effect was straightforward. Indians were prohibited from producing, collecting, or selling salt that had not been processed through British-controlled channels. The natural deposits of salt that appeared on the coastline, left by the retreating tide, accumulated in coastal lagoons, crystallized in the warm, shallow water of the Indian Ocean, could not be collected by the people who lived beside them. You could not pick up what the sea had put down at your feet, not without paying the imperial salt tax. The law served two purposes that reinforced each other. It protected the revenue from British-controlled salt production and distribution, which processed and sold salt at prices set to maximize tax yield. And it prevented the development of any Indian salt trade that might operate outside British oversight. The practical effect was that a country with an extensive coastline, enormous natural salt deposits, and a population of several 100 million people was required to buy its salt, an essential mineral, as necessary as water, through an administrative structure whose primary interest was in extracting revenue from it. This is what Gandhi chose as the instrument of defiance. The Dandi March began on March 12, 1930. Gandhi set out from his ashram at Sabarmati, near Ahmedabad, with 78 volunteers. The destination was the coastal town of Dandi, approximately 240 miles to the south and west. On the shore of the Arabian Sea, the walk took 24 days. People joined the procession along the route, from villages it passed through, from nearby towns, from the farms and fields adjacent to the road. By the time Gandhi reached the coast, what had begun with 78 people had become something the newspapers of 3 continents were following. At dawn on April 6, Gandhi walked to the shore. He bent. He picked up a small clot of natural salt from the beach, left there by the retreating water. The Salt Act was broken, publicly, deliberately, in front of witnesses, journalists, and a camera. The act itself required no equipment, no organization, no specialist knowledge. That was the point. Salt had been chosen precisely because it was universally understood. Everyone in India bought salt. Everyone knew what the tax meant. The person who had never thought about trade policy, or colonial economics or constitutional law, understood perfectly what it meant to be forbidden to collect a mineral that the ocean left freely on the shore. The abstraction of colonial governance became, in the image of a man bending to the waterline, completely concrete. No one needed the politics explained. The gesture was the explanation. The walk itself had already changed something before the salt was picked up. A man in his 60s, walking 240 miles through the Gujarat countryside, accompanied by volunteers, through villages where people came out to see and to join. It was unhurried, it was visible, it moved at human pace through human landscape, and every day of it was news. Something was being demonstrated about the scale of what opposition could look like, before a single law had been technically broken. What followed was not a single event, but an escalation. In May 1930, a march on the Darasana Salt Works, a British-controlled salt production facility north of Bombay, was organized, with Gandhi, by that point in prison, and the leadership of the march taken up by others. Thousands of protesters arrived and advanced, in successive waves, on the salt storage facilities. Police with steel-tipped bamboo lathes met each wave. The protesters did not fight back. They did not run. They advanced and were beaten down, and the next group advanced. An American journalist, Webb Miller, was present and witnessed the full day's events. His account, filed to United Press and published in newspapers across the United States and Europe, described in plain and precise language what he had seen. The accounts reached a very large audience in countries that had an opinion about the nature of British imperial governance, and the opinion shifted. The Salt March did not end British rule in India. That would take 17 more years, another war and a complicated negotiation. But it changed the scale and the character of what organized resistance could look like, how many people it could involve, how directly it could be communicated, what kind of action in service of what kind of principle could attract and hold the attention of the world. And at its center was salt, the oldest political mineral, the thing that had funded roads and armies and kingdoms for 8,000 years, which still had, in 1930, enough weight behind it, enough shared human understanding of what it was and what it cost and what it meant, to carry an entire movement. While Gandhi walked, something else was happening on the other side of the world that was, in its way, equally revealing. In Cheshire, in the northwest of England, the ground was sinking. Cheshire had been producing salt for roughly 2,000 years. The county sits above a deep bed of rock salt and the brine springs that rose through it. Water that had filtered through the salt-bearing rock and emerged at the surface saturated with mineral had been exploited since at least the Roman period. The towns that grew around those springs carried the evidence in their names: Northwich, Middlewich, Nantwich. The suffix wich comes from Old English, meaning a brine spring settlement, the same linguistic principle as the Hall place names of Central Europe, marking the same fact in a different language. Here was the mineral, here people came for it. The coming was regular enough to name the place for it. Through the 19th century, the extraction of Cheshire salt industrialized. Steam-powered pumps drew brine up from deep underground in volumes far beyond what the surface springs had ever supplied. The salt was processed and packaged and distributed across Britain and across the empire, into West Africa and India and the Caribbean, in quantities that required the word industrial. It was useful. It was profitable. It was, for a period, the center of something that felt permanent. But the pumping created a problem that the operators noticed and noted and largely continued operating around. When brine was drawn up from underground, it left a cavity. The salt-bearing rocks surrounding the cavity dissolved outward as groundwater moved through it. The space grew, and the ground above, the surface, the soil, the roads and buildings and fields of ordinary Cheshire, had nothing beneath it where there had once been something solid. It settled, sometimes slowly, a matter of inches over years, buildings tilting slightly, doorframes going out of square, roads developing a particular kind of slump. Sometimes suddenly, a collapse of the roof of a cavity, the surface dropping overnight in a way that was unmistakable and often dramatic. In Northwich, the problem became so persistent that buildings were constructed specifically to accommodate it. Houses were built on metal frames fitted with screw jacks at the base, so that as the ground settled and the structure tilted, it could be wound up again, leveled, reset, adjusted to whatever the earth had become beneath it. Photographs from the late 19th century show streets in Northwich at angles that would look deliberate if you did not know the cause. The Witten Flash appeared in 1880, a lake, not a flooding river or a burst reservoir, a lake that had not been there the previous week, covering what had been agricultural land. The ground above an exhausted brine field had given way, and the water table had filled the space. It is still there, a quiet, reed-fringed expanse of water in the Cheshire countryside, fed by groundwater, visited by birds. Nothing about it announces what it is the absence of. By the middle of the 20th century, the economic reason for Cheshire's salt towns had largely dissolved, not because the salt was gone, It was still there, still extracted, still sold. But refrigeration had replaced preservation as the primary method of keeping food. The cold chain of industrial distribution, synthetic preservatives, the vacuum-sealed container, all of it had reduced the dependence on mineral preservation to almost nothing. Salt was still used in food processing, still purchased by every household, still necessary. But it was cheap, available everywhere, no longer central to anything. The witch towns remained, but the thing that had made them matter had drained away, as quietly as the brine draining through the worked-out ground beneath them. Hold both images for a moment. A man on a beach in Gujarat, bending to the waterline, picking up a clot of salt from the ground where the sea had left it. That act required the mineral to still be the thing that had built roads and funded kingdoms, and held the body together through winter, required it to still carry weight, political weight, the weight of necessity that everyone understood without explanation. And beneath a field in Cheshire, the ground settling over the worked-out places where the mineral had been. The geological consequence of centuries of extraction slowly resolving itself into a new shape. Quiet, unhurried, entirely without drama. One is a peak, the other is an ending. Both are about the same white mineral, in the same century, in different corners of the same depleting empire. Salt is still everywhere, in the body, as it always has been, in every kitchen, in the language, and it is the language where the last part of this story goes. Because the mineral that built roads and funded revolutions and preserved the dead left its ghost in ordinary words. And some of those words are so common that we use them without thinking about what they carry. Salt is still with us. It is just that we mostly stopped noticing it. It sits in a shaker on the table, and we reach for it without thinking. The thought does not arrive that we are reaching for the same mineral that built roads and funded empires and changed the political map of Northern Europe, that it has been taxed and smuggled and marched against and used to hold the shape of the dead. We know in some general way that salt has a history, but we do not feel the weight of it. The mineral is too cheap, too available, too ordinary now. Except in the language. In the language the weight is still there. There is a root. Sal, Latin for salt. Before it was Latin it was Proto-Indo-European. Sal, a root so old that it predates the language families it produced, predates writing, predates most of the civilizations this episode has moved through. The root was present in the mouths of people who had not yet settled, who carried their mineral in pouches or traded it at seasonal gatherings, who had no words for empire or taxation or currency, but knew the taste of salt on the tongue and had a name for it. Sal, a root spoken by people who would become, over the following several thousand years, half of Europe and beyond. That root sits at the center of a family of words that branches in many directions, each branch touching something ordinary, something we use without thought. Pull on any one of them, and the history pulls back. Salary. This episode visited this word in an earlier chapter, when the Tagaza miners were loading camels, and the question was whether Roman soldiers were paid in salt or in a salt word. The short answer was, in a salt word. In salarium, a Latin allowance whose connection to sal is unambiguous, even if the exact nature of the connection was hedged by the Romans themselves. Said to be, they wrote. Perhaps. It is told that. It is worth returning to salary here, briefly, not to re-examine the uncertainty, but simply to notice what the word has outlasted. The mines at Holstadt are a museum. The Via Salaria is a suburban road on the edge of Rome. The gabelle is gone. The Hanseatic League is a footnote. Tagaza is a ruin in the northern Malian desert. visited by almost no one, but salary is in use today in every language that borrowed the concept from Latin, by people who do not associate their wages with a white mineral, who have never thought about the connection, who would be mildly surprised to be told it. The salt word for what we earn. Still working. Every month. Salad. From the Latin herba salata, salted greens, the Romans put salt on their vegetables, not as a finishing touch on a completed dish, but as a preparation. Green things dressed with the mineral, made more palatable by it, the salt being the active ingredient rather than the garnish. The word for the practice became the word for the dish. A salad is, etymologically, what happens when you apply salt to leaves. This is not a complicated etymology. It does not require any specialist knowledge to follow, but it means that every time someone orders a salad, in any language that borrowed or translated the Latin term, they are using a word that describes an act of salting, without knowing that is what they are saying. Sauce. From the Latin salsa, salted, something salted, a liquid or condiment added to food to make it more interesting, defined at its root by the mineral it contained. The Romans salted almost everything, including the accompaniments to food, and they named those accompaniments for the thing they had in common. Garum, the great fermented fish sauce that crossed the empire in sealed amphorae, was salsa applied to fish, the flavor of salt and fermentation distilled into something that could travel. Sauce is a salt word. Everything that makes food more interesting has salt in it, including the word for the category of things that make food more interesting. Sausage. From the Latin salsus, salted meat, not defined at its etymological root by its shape or its casing or its spicing, defined by its preservation. A sausage is something that has been salted, and the salting is what the word names. In a world where the only reliable way to keep meat beyond the day of slaughter was to preserve it with mineral, to salt it, to dry it, to hold it against decay, the word for the preserved meat was a salt word. The sausage carries the chemistry in its name, whether or not the chemistry is still strictly necessary. A modern sausage has as much refrigeration behind its longevity as salt. But the name does not know this, and keeps the older record. Salami. From the Italian salare, to salt, the cured meats of Europe, salami, bresaola, coppa, the whole generous family of preserved preparations that fill delicatessen counters, are products of the same chemistry that the Nile fishermen practiced, that the Egyptian embalmers applied with their pouches of natron, that the herring packers at Scania understood every autumn, remove the moisture, hold what remains. The mineral is what makes it possible. The names carry that knowledge. A salami is something that has been salted. The word is the process, preserved in the name long after the product has been transferred to a refrigerated shelf. Salsa. The condiment is direct, from salsa, from salsus, from the same root that produced garum and sausage, and the long family of preserved and seasoned things. Something sauced, something salted, something from the tradition of flavored liquids that salt made possible, and that salt made complex. The condiment carries its chemistry in the open. The dance shares the name, arrived there by a different route. Through Latin American Spanish, through cultural association, the condiment's heat and color, becoming a name for something that moved with the same vivid energy. Salt, in this small and unexpected way, contributed to the naming of a dance. Something that preserved became something celebratory. The mineral that kept the dead is also, distantly, in the name of the thing that makes the living move. The family extends further than any of these. Saline, the salt solution that maintains the mineral concentration the body requires. The word salt itself, In every Germanic language that inherited it directly rather than through Latin, salt in English, Salz in German, Zout in Dutch, all from the same root that produced sal in Latin, sel in French, sal in Spanish and Portuguese. A family of words spread across the languages of half the world, each one marking the same mineral, the same taste, the same recognition. A root so old that it was present in the mouths of people speaking a language that no longer exists, about a mineral they were already using, before the world this episode has described had come into being. Come back to the kitchen table. It is morning, or close to it. The room is quiet. The light through the window is the kind that happens before the day has quite decided what kind of day it will be, still and faintly grey, the particular quality of early light before anything is required of it. And there on the table, where it always is, the salt shaker, small and familiar and unremarkable in the way that only the most indispensable things manage to be. There is no drama in looking at it, that is the point. What this episode has traced, across 8 chapters and the length of human history, is not the story of something extraordinary. Salt is not extraordinary. It is, in fact, the opposite. It is the most ordinary mineral, the most familiar taste, the cheapest thing on the table. What makes it interesting is precisely that it was too important to be merely ordinary for most of the time that people have been living in organized communities. They built mines into mountains for it. They built towns over the mines, and named the towns for what was beneath them, and the names have lasted. They salted their dead, and constructed an entire cosmology around the fact that the dead could be held intact, and built 3,000 years of civilization at the center of that cosmology. They built roads to carry the mineral from where it was to where it was needed, and the roads carried everything else as well. They formed alliances of merchant cities to protect the routes, and went to war over the passages those routes depended on, and signed treaties that restructured a continent's commercial geography, over herring, which required salt in a sea that was grey and cold and full of consequence. They taxed it. They invented elaborate administrative architectures to extract maximum revenue from something no one could refuse to buy, and they maintained those architectures for centuries, through revolutions that swept everything else away, because the logic never changed. And they walked 240 miles across Gujarat to protest a tax on what the sea left freely on the shore, because salt was still. In 1930, in the 20th century, the thing that everyone understood without explanation. And then it became ordinary again. Not suddenly, not by any single decision, but refrigeration arrived, and the cold chain and the synthetic preservatives, and the economic reason that had made salt worth taxing and fighting over, and mining and marching for, dissolved as quietly as the walls of a Cheshire brine field dissolving outward into the darkness beneath. The mineral was still there. It was simply no longer the hinge the world turned on. It receded into the background, into the shaker on the table, into the recipe that says season to taste, into the ordinary where it had always belonged, and where it returned when the extraordinary ceased to require it. The ghost of it is in the words. Salary, salad, sauce, sausage, salami, salsa, the long family of spread through the languages of half the world, quietly marking where the minerals sat at the center of things, each word a trace, a remainder, a small preserved evidence of the time when salt was the thing that built your economy and funded your kingdom and made the difference between a winter you survived and one you did not, between a body that lasted and one that did not. The words remember, even when the people using them have stopped noticing. The salt shaker is still on the table. It will be there when the light changes, and when the day begins in earnest, and when the morning becomes whatever it becomes. It has been wherever people gather to eat for longer than anyone can trace. It was on a table, in a Hanseatic merchant's house, in a city that no longer exists by that name. It was beside a fire in a Roman field camp, on a road built to carry it. It was in a clay vessel above a brine spring in the foothills of the Carpathians, 8,000 years before any of those places had names that anyone now uses. The white mineral in the shaker has been taxed, smuggled, worshipped, and fought over. It preserved the dead and built the roads that connected the living. It paid, in some form, in some sense, for the work that made civilizations possible. It was marched against and marched for. It was too important, for too long, to be as quiet as it is now. Some things are too old to be surprised by anything. They simply remain, and wait, and are there in the morning. Good night.